Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Petrilli. I'm the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Welcome, those of you here in person. If you are new to Fordham, we are one of the nation's leading education policy think tanks. We study and comment on a variety of education reforms, including standards-based reforms, including that thing you might have heard of called the Common Core, parental choice, including charter schools, as well as governance reforms. We also do on-the-ground work in the great state of Ohio. So that's one thing that makes us unique. Thomas B. Fordham was from Dayton, Ohio, so that is our hometown. We have a team there that actually authorizes charter schools throughout Ohio. And we have a team in Columbus that works on education policy reforms. They're busy trying to get a big charter school reform bill across the finish line as we speak. So welcome to Fordham. And I'm really honored to welcome you to what's going to be a fantastic event, Turnaround Districts, Lessons from Louisiana, Tennessee, and Michigan. And I'm really excited to see such a full house here. I know we've got quite a few people tuning in online as well. You know, we joke that here in Washington, it is not hard to get a big crowd if you have a topic like ESEA reauthorization. You know, people will show up, or even Common Core. But to get a Washington crowd here together to hear about things that are happening on the ground in real places in the country is very encouraging, and I think demonstrates the huge interest that is growing in these turnaround districts. For those of you who are following online, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag RSD Lessons, RSD Lessons. You may notice me looking at my phone. I'm not looking at my email most of the time. I'm trying to follow the Twitter conversation, and we'll try to bring that into the real discussion here today as well. So I'm going to have the honor to introduce our great panel in just a few minutes. But first, let me say a little bit about our interest at Fordham in these recovery school districts, or whatever we're going to call them. We're going to call them turnaround school districts today, Nelson? Is that
whatever you
try that? Turnaround
You're the
school districts. But namely, the original recovery school district in Louisiana, Tennessee's Achievement School District, and Michigan's Educational Achievement Authority. Maybe we can vote at the end who has the best name. Achievement School District seems to be used by an increasing number of states, so perhaps you guys win on that. Now, it's often been said, at least by Checker Finn, I know I've heard him say it, that a think tank is a place where we go to examine reality to see if it conforms with theory. And in theory, at least, these turnaround school districts appear to be extremely promising innovations. And in particular, compared to their cousins in the school turnaround space, either individual efforts to turn around individual schools, like we see in the Federal School Improvement Grant Program, or state efforts to take over failing school districts, where we see this happening in places like Camden or Newark. There's a new one that's about to happen in Youngstown, Ohio. But these efforts where the state comes in and basically says, okay, the school board and the superintendent, you're done, and now the state is in charge. And the reason that these turnaround school districts are seen, in theory at least, as being more promising is because, I would argue, they diagnose the disease correctly. That most other turnaround efforts, they believe that the disease that they're trying to cure are failing schools, chronically low-performing schools. Whereas the people behind a lot of these efforts to create turnaround school districts, they see low-performing schools as just a symptom. And that the symptom, that the real disease are dysfunctional districts, or even really beyond that, dysfunctional governance arrangements at the local and state and even federal level. So let me unpack that a little bit. And that if that is the real disease, dysfunctional governance arrangements, then we need some kind of reform that gets to the heart of that and that tries something very differently. So what are some of these dysfunctional governance arrangements? Well, we all know that in many of our big city school systems, elected school boards are frequently captured by special interests. I hope this is not news to you, right? I mean, Terry, Mo and Chubb argued this back in the early 1990s. We see this all the time, that in big city school districts, particularly places where almost everybody sending their kids to the public school is themselves poor and therefore don't have a lot of political power, that the teacher unions and other employee groups have been able to capture those school boards. And when that happens, the school boards then sometimes have a hard time making difficult decisions that might be best for kids, but that might not be best for the people working in the school system. Among that means signing off on union contracts that oftentimes tie schools in red tape and make it very hard, especially for high poverty schools, which tend to be the ones that end up getting labeled as failing or chronically low performing. They make it very hard for them to recruit and retain excellent teachers. The dysfunctional governance arrangements also can include dysfunctional relationships between the school and the central offices, which themselves can oftentimes be very bureaucratic and broken for long times, as well as dysfunctional relationships between the school district and the state. Right? The states out there are frustrated year after year of low performance, so they pass law after law after law to try to fix it. At the end of the day, you end up with a crushing load of new regulations, of micromanagement, and all that seems to do is impede the autonomy and authority of people trying to do the work at the local level, while not really getting at true accountability. So turnaround districts, in theory, cut through all of this by plucking low-performing schools out of dysfunctional districts and by creating new statewide greenfield entities to work on turnarounds, and by establishing new autonomies at the school level around staffing and budgeting and curriculum and everything else. These reforms attack the disease that's causing the problem and give local leaders a chance to do the real work. And the hard work, and no doubt we all know, and we're going to talk about this, extremely hard work of actually turning around low-performing schools. At least that's the theory. But what does this look like in reality? To find out, we at Fordham turned to Nelson Smith, a friend of ours, a longtime charter school advocate, a recent inductee into the Charter School Hall of Fame just last week. Nelson, congratulations. A very well-deserved honor. And now his day job as a senior advisor to the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. We asked him to chronicle the efforts of these turnaround districts in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Michigan. And he wrote 3 great reports, one on each of these, that you can find on the Fordham website. And then recently he penned a capstone report that we just published a few weeks ago, trying to tease out the lessons from what he sees. And it's this report that we're really going to dive into today. So we are thrilled to have Nelson with us, and we're doubly thrilled, or I guess I could say triply thrilled, that the leaders of each of these districts are here to join us as well. First, we've got Chris Barbick, the superintendent of Tennessee's Achievement School District. He has held that role since 2001. Prior to 2010. 2010. Sorry
Feels
about
like
that.
2000.
Yes, there we go, 2010. You know the day, how many, yes, what is that, 1,000?
Went up on 4 years, August 1st.
Good. Before that, he was the founder and CEO of Yes Prep Public Schools, fantastic network of charter schools that won the Broad Prize in 2012. Not so bad. He taught in the Houston Independent School District and was a core member of Teach for America. And just one last thing, in 1995, he won Houston's Outstanding Young Educator Award. So Chris walks the walk. It doesn't just talk the talk. Impressive for those of us who work at a think tank as our day job. So looking forward to hearing all about what's happening in Tennessee and particularly in Memphis, where most of the work has focused. Then we've got Veronica Conformi, that is just like Mike Petrilli, so I can practice that. She is the Chancellor of Michigan's Education Achievement Authority, and she was appointed in 2014. Right? So Veronica is new there. This is important because, as you will hear, the efforts in Michigan have not gone as well as they have in other places, as Nelson will discuss. But those struggles that the EAA has had preceded Veronica, and we'll get to talk about how things are going now that she's been on board. Before this, she served as vice president for the Access to Opportunity campaign at the College Board, working to increase AP access and college enrollment for students from low-income backgrounds, not just working, but succeeding tremendously. See the huge increase in AP access. And before that, she was the COO in the New York City Department of Education. So Veronica, thank you for being here with us today. And finally, last but not least, Patrick Dubard, the superintendent of Louisiana's Recovery School District. He has been in that role since 2012, right? I assume replacing John White when he moved on to become the state commissioner of education in Louisiana. this is obviously a huge player in New Orleans, where now 93% of the kids attend charter schools. Is that right? And we're going to hear all about that. Patrick started as a social studies teacher in New Orleans, went on to work at the Louisiana Department of Education before transitioning into this very important role. So that is our panel. Here's how it's going to work. We're going to hear from Nelson to give us some flavor of what he found when he went out and studied these 3 districts. He's going to, in particular, tell us some of his recommendations for the other states that are going down this path. Nevada, just this spring, created a new achievement school district, so they are definitely getting in. Pennsylvania is debating a bill right now that would create one. Georgia will have a constitutional amendment on the ballot next fall, I believe, that would create one of these things. So, we could quickly go from 3 of these in the country to 6 of these, if not more, in short order. Nelson has some clear advice for people who are going down that road. We're going to hear about it. Please welcome Nelson Smith.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everybody. Good to be here back at Fordham today. And I want to first begin by thanking my 3 distinguished colleagues here for their generosity with both time and candor. As I was writing the 3 studies of their districts, they were remarkably forthcoming about what was working and what still had to be worked on. So I really want to say thanks to all of you for helping explain and helping us understand what this phenomenon is about. I'm just going to take a few minutes here and give some lofty thoughts about what I've seen in looking at these 3 districts and looking ahead at the other potential ones. As Mike said, this is just the beginning. I don't know that you would call this a full-fledged movement yet, but the idea of turnaround districts, opportunity school districts, recovery, achievement school districts seems to be catching on at fairly high levels among policymakers in the country. So in addition to the ones that Mike mentioned, there was also a bill in Texas this year that missed narrowly. The Mississippi State Board of Education has ordered up a study of this for October. There have been variations on the theme in Wisconsin, Utah, Arkansas, and Missouri. It's been in the public presses in South Carolina. And as he said, just recently, the Pennsylvania Senate has approved their version of this kind of district, and it's now in the Pennsylvania House Education Committee. So we could see another one popping up there. This is not an easy thing to do. And there's always a danger when somebody kind of hears about good results in one place, they say, well, let's just copy that. And one of my recommendations in the report is don't try to paint by numbers. This thing has to work in the particular culture of your particular state. It may not even be permissible, given the state laws in your state. As Mike mentioned, Georgia, just as they did with the Charter School Commission, the state commission, has to enact a constitutional amendment through referendum next year in order for this statewide district to be approved. So there are some very local-centric states that make this nearly impossible to do. But there are some commonalities among the districts that are up and running so far, and I want to just talk very briefly about what I see in those districts. The number one most striking one is that what they all mean in the bottom line is that the local district has really lost what Ted Couldery would call the exclusive franchise. States have always been able to take over a district, or in extreme cases, take over a school if there was a matter of mayhem or safety involved for the students. But what they have now in these districts is a model for making state takeover of individual low-performing schools a fairly routine part of the accountability portfolio. This is new. This has not happened before. In the Louisiana Recovery District started in 2004, and it really means that when a district, whatever their average performance or whatever a few schools are doing well, if a district cannot actually solve the problem of chronically low-performing schools, and I mean really, really bad schools at the bottom 5% by any measure, then the state, as the constitutional entity responsible for education in our country, has the right to move in. And now there is a framework for doing that. And I think that's the great change that these districts mean. There are some functional similarities, as I said, at the bottom 5%. That's defined different ways according to different states' accountability systems, but it's important that these districts really deal with schools that are not functioning well, not just with kids who don't test well, So you see an effort to sort of screen out, for example, dropout recovery schools, which may be doing fine, but be testing at the bottom of the state barrel. I think they're driven, the new ones are driven principally in two words by frustrated governors. These early districts all had some form of extraordinary financial incentives behind them, whether it was the federal charter money in the case of the Recovery School District, or whether it was Race to the Top, which was really what kicked off both the Michigan and Tennessee districts, although they then took different paths. Now, you don't have that big carrot out there. What you have are governors, particularly, looking at chronically dysfunctional schools and not seeing any movement on them, even though the No Child Left Behind Act and various other programs like the school improvement grants have been out there to try and turn around low-performing schools. It just hasn't happened with these chronic low performers. The other interesting to me commonality in all three cases is that they all began with the notion that the state would have the option of either directly running schools on the one hand or inviting charter operators to take over some of the schools and manage them. And each of the three districts, to some extent or another, has moved away from the direct run model and more towards the chartering and portfolio model, to the point where the Recovery School District is now, in fact, 100% charter. There are some differences in structure and accountability, and the basic structural differences in this case are between the Barbic and Dobart districts, the Tennessee and Louisiana district on the one hand, and the Michigan district on the other. Both of the first two were created as essentially statewide districts that were at first very state-oriented and then gained greater independence, but they were independent districts. The Michigan Education Achievement Authority started out differently. It is fashioned through what's called an interlocal agreement between Detroit Public Schools and Eastern Michigan University. And every year, legislators have tried to go and get it codified as a statewide district resembling the other two, and each year that has failed. What may be changing now is that Governor Snyder, who really was the force behind creating the EAA, has now moved the State Redesign and Reform Office directly under his supervision. So there may be a way of kind of playing some chess moves now so that the EAA has more direct statewide reach. One of the other things that distinguishes the districts is that they have approached goal setting a little bit differently. As far as I know right now, the Tennessee district is still the only one that says out loud, we're going to take bottom 5% schools and move them to the top 25% over 5 years. I think, Veronica, you'll probably talk about the EAA kind of inching toward that direction. But one of the questions is, how hard are the goals and how much time do you really need? So you will see in this very attractive, if brief, recap, it's the printout of a few pages of the report, which I urge you to read online. There's a lot of recommendations here in essentially two categories, policy and management. The first one for those who are thinking about creating a district, and then the second for those who are going to actually run it. And I'm going to mix a bit of those two in talking about a few basic lessons. One is that I think you have to think long term. There was one state legislator, I think it was in Georgia, who was talking about the Opportunity School District bill there, and he said, well, you know, we're kind of looking at this as a kind of an emergency room where you can take schools and put them in, turn them around, and release them. That's probably the wrong analogy or the wrong metaphor. It's a little more like a rehabilitation hospital. These things, none of them have worked quite as quickly as everybody had hoped at first. So learning is the constant, time should be the variable, I think, in this case. The second is obviously expect bumps, expect controversy. You are, in fact, taking the franchise away from local folks, from community folks. We have a strong tradition of local education authority in this country. And frankly, in the big urban districts, some of the people who are going to be disenfranchised are going to be people who have taught for years, and their parents and their parents. And so, as in the case of New Orleans, the teachers who were put out of work after Katrina by the Orleans Parish School Board, when the RSD was created, they sued, and the largely African-American teacher corps championed the idea that they should be returned to that position, to their jobs. The courts have settled that. They've ruled against the teachers, but it still remains an active issue for a number of people in the community. Third, fund these things. There are extraordinary costs associated with getting these things underway. In the case of Michigan particularly, there was just no upfront public funding of any kind. Fortunately, philanthropy kicked in and really made the first year or two possible for the EAA. But the state should be showing that it is committed to actually doing this and putting public funds behind it. And finally, I'll just reiterate, as this idea catches on, people may look at Louisiana or Tennessee or Michigan and say, great idea, it worked there, let's do it here. I think what you should do is take the intention, take the dynamism, take the determination to actually get results on the bottom tier of schools in the state, and then adapt it to your own state's culture, your own state's accountability system, your own state's politics, and then make it work that way. That's all I'll say for now, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Well said. Nelson, you have a shot at becoming a member of the Think Tank Presenter Hall of Fame as well. Came in under time, was interesting. Okay, so I'm trying. These jokes, you laugh at them if you find them funny. Okay, there we go. Get a beer, people here in the audience. It's right over there. So let me start. I didn't tell the panelists I would do this, but I think it's important to put some questions out there before we dig into the nuts and bolts to just talk about big picture. There are some on the right, and I just saw this even on Twitter, who would say, you know what, this is all a waste of time. Why are we even trying to turn around these schools at all? If these schools are chronically low performing, they have nothing else has worked before, why not just close them down and replace them with better schools, such as better high performing charter schools? Would anybody like to address that from your perspective on why we don't just cut to the chase and go right there with closure and replacement? And Nelson, you're welcome to chime in too.
Well, I'll start by just saying I think the beauty of this model is that it gives you the opportunity to go there if that's something that will work, if you can find really effective operators. And you know, it won't always be the case that there's a long line of people from other cities who have done great work who are going to be lining up to help you out. If you've got a stream of talent, if you've got the right operators, you can go in that direction. And I think the experience shows that there is some real merit to thinking about going portfolio, and I would call it that, with the charter operators from day one. But I'm really interested to hear what our colleagues have to say.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you're a charter guy, right? I mean, our charter people were supposed to believe, look, these districts are hopeless. Even if you pluck it out of a district, it's still hopeless. Why not just shut them down?
Well, before I start, Nelson, I think you did a great job capturing a lot of complicated, complex ideas in the report. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I would encourage you guys to take a peek at that.
Thanks.
I think the way we think about this is that it's the replacement without the closure. I think closure elicits all sorts of emotion and energy, and rightly so. And the way we've tried to approach this with our schools, and just quick background for those of you that don't know much about the ASD. So when we start the school year in August, we'll have 30 schools, roughly 30 schools. Over 85% of our schools, so about 24, 25 of our schools will be charter schools. And then we directly run a small cluster of 5 schools that we essentially operate as an internal network. It's run almost like a CMO. But these are neighborhood schools. These aren't charter schools where you set up shop in the neighborhood and parents choose to come to the school. Essentially what we're doing is we are running the neighborhood school like a charter. It's still the neighborhood school, still the same attendance boundaries. And so, what we would argue is that this is a chance to get at some of the positive aspects of doing, what some may call a close and replace strategy without having to actually close the school. Because there's just so many other implications when you do that in a community, especially in the communities that we're working in, that we feel like this is actually a much better approach. And I think it gets at one of the questions that we were asked around lessons learned. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we've learned through this is that having an existential threat, having the state be there to say, look, if you continue to neglect the schools in certain communities, if you continue to push teachers of a certain caliber in mass in certain neighborhoods, if you continue to make sure that every time there's a resource question that the communities that our schools are in don't get those resources, that there's now a price to pay. And it's not just every year when the annual results come out, you get 24 hours of shaming in a news cycle in the newspaper. There's actually real accountability. You are going to lose the privilege of running that school and serving those kids. And I think if you see the type of urgency and energy that's created, especially in Memphis where a lot of our schools are, I mean, folks at the board level and the superintendent himself would tell you that urgency's made everybody better. And I think a big lesson is that, you know, these become an existential threat, and that existential threat is an important part of how we make sure that schools in certain neighborhoods don't continue to be neglected.
And so what I feel like I hear you say, Chris, and Nelson both say, is that closure is on the table. And in fact, in some of these states, without some kind of turnaround district, there was really no mechanism for the state to close an individual school.
We don't close schools. I mean, by law, I mean, we can consolidate schools after we've run them, but we do not see ourselves, and nor does the law really set us up to be a school closure mechanism. We are clearly there to replace and to turn around and to make the school better.
All right. Now, let me ask a different question from the left, and then we'll get to this. And the question from the left is, come on, these schools that you're targeting, these are merely schools that are high poverty. It's not that they're low performing, it's that they have kids in them that are low performing because the challenges that they bring. And I have to say, I worry that in some of these states, I think in Louisiana, I think in Tennessee, that you are using mostly proficiency-based models to identify the schools that end up there instead of looking at individual student growth over time. So, you know, the question is, how confident are you that you are identifying schools that actually are chronically low performing and are not just schools that serve lots of kids coming from poverty who may be making good progress while they're in those schools? It's just not showing up in their proficiency rates.
Mike, first, let me just say thank you and Fordham for having us here today. It's truly a privilege and an honor to just have this much interest in the work that we're doing. And Nelson, thank you for your research and everything that you've been doing. Just truly think you've done a good job, as Chris mentioned, in trying to make simple a very complex type issue. I think around, you know, as you described, those on the left who will argue looking at growth and the confidence level we have in proficiency, I think in Louisiana we have a great amount of confidence in how we're going about determining whether schools are failing or not. We have a very clear accountability system, a grading system that shows whether or not students are performing at a proficient level as defined by Louisiana. And with that, overwhelmingly, particularly in schools in the RSD, almost 100% of the students or close to it are determined or classified as students that are in poverty. And so 2007, those students, only 23% were scoring at a state-defined proficient level in New Orleans. Today, it's almost 60%. Of those, African-American students were scoring almost identical same percentages because we serve almost 100% African-American students. And we've closed the achievement gap for non-African-American students and students statewide. And we've also surpassed African-American student counterparts statewide. New Orleans kids compared to other kids in the state of Louisiana. And I think what it's all about is about that, you know, people will talk about growth, and we're working on like looking at now growth mechanisms because, you know, we've moved the lever so far and so fast that we know that at some level you're going to either plateau or you might even take a step or two back before you can really then make some more progress. And so I think, you know, it's more about keeping in mind, not so much about governance structures and, you know, accountability. You know, it's always hard for me, I'm glad you said in your opening remarks, you know, I sometimes shudder at like just theoreticians versus practitioners. So I try to embrace both. But these are babies. These are like children, young people. So for me, in 25 years in education, it's never been about like just policy and, you know, people get excited about that and, you know, other things going with it and looking at the stats and all that. It's about the everyday real world that these are babies, young people that are trapped in chronically underperforming schools. And in some instances, I know in Baton Rouge, there was a school that was over a decade. And I remember the debate of the state board whether or not we were going to take schools outside of New Orleans. And my question was, like, basically, like, if that was your child in a school that had been failing for 10 straight years, would you want them in this school? What would you want to do? Would you want to close it? Would you call it what you want? Close it, turn it around, whatever. But I would not want my child to be sitting in a school that has been defined as academically underperforming, which in Louisiana, that means the children are 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 grade levels behind. That's just criminal. That's a violation of civil rights. And so for me, it's about continuing to work to make progress in ensuring that we have better quality for young people. And so, it just all ties into how we look at that, and we just really want to push that forward.
All right, well said. Let's get you in here, Veronica. So on either of these two questions, what's your take from Michigan?
So in Detroit, there are 51% of schools that are already chartered. So we have a big,
Okay, just I'm sorry, project that way. Yeah.
we have a big charter sector already. In the EAA, the 15 schools that we serve, we're serving kids that are coming from a 1.2 mile radius. It is the kids that actually don't have access to anything else. They don't have access to transportation in a city like Detroit, a major equity issue for us. And so therefore, we don't have an option but to create school and create great schools for them in the communities that they live in. And that's the right that they have.
Yeah.
And so it's not an either or. I think my experiences in New York City also teach me that turnaround is very much about consolidating, closing what existed, and allowing new folks to come in with a fresh perspective and an eager attitude to do the hardest work.
Great. So the argument there is that in the EAA, at least, you really are serving the hardest to serve kids already. Chris, really quickly on this question about poverty and growth, proficiency. I mean, are you at all worried that any of your schools that you have now taken over, that they actually were relatively high-performing schools if you looked at growth instead of at proficiency?
Well, I mean, I think when you talk about growth, it's got to be to a standard, right? And the standard still has to be our kids reading on grade level. And so, Tennessee has a long history. I mean, the whole, value-added movement that Bill Sanders started in Tennessee. So, we have value-added measure scores at the district level, at the school level, at the teacher level. And so, we're certainly looking at growth both once the school becomes part of the ASD, but even prior to that. The priority list is very much about proficiency levels, and I think it should be. It's run every 3 years, and now there was a recent law that was just passed this last session where if a school on the priority list receives a 4 or a 5, which is above average or very high above average growth, then that school would stay with the local district for a year. So I think what we've tried to do is have a balanced approach at how we look at this. But I think, Patrick said it well. I mean, I think this is the intersection of policy and practice. And, we want to make sure we get this right. We want to make sure we're making thoughtful decisions. We know that there's lots of politics around, taking a school out of local control. But at the end of the day, these are kids and families that, in many cases, in most of the cases that we're talking about, these aren't schools where this happened overnight. This has been a problem for decades. And at some point, we got to say enough is enough, and that our kids and families deserve better than what they've been getting.
Okay, good. Nelson did a great job laying out some of his recommendations. We're going to dive into those in just a minute. But before we do that, just thinking broadly, if you're giving advice to folks in other states, either policymakers or practitioners, what advice would you give them based on your hard-earned experience? And by the way, I'm reading on Twitter from the Pennsylvania Business Council, hello folks, that the Pennsylvania Senate passed SB 6 last night, 27-18, that would create an achievement school district. So it's on to the Pennsylvania House. So this could happen in Pennsylvania. What advice do you give to the folks in Pennsylvania if they're about to embark on this sort of thing?
My advice to them would be, do Pennsylvania. Do what works for you. They have the little saying, do you, right? And so, they have to look at what their climate is and basically determine what's best for Pennsylvania. And I think, with that, have an end game in mind. How will you define success? What does success look like? So then you can work backwards from that. And so I would just encourage them to, really look at, again, what works best for them, and then to define success and work from there.
Okay. Veronica?
I would say tons and tons of engagement and listening. Take the year to plan. Make sure that things are codified as we talked about and as Nelson talked about in his report. The EAA was created through an interlocal agreement, and then legislation was tried to be passed, creating all sorts of opposition from school districts and lobbying against it. And so the actual legislation never passed. So I would say make sure it's on solid footing, very poised to do this very, very hard work. and then engage tons of folks in a conversation about what it's going to look like at the local level.
And let me just settle on that a little bit, because that's such a great point, Veronica. And we hear that in all kinds of reforms. There's a debate right now what's happened in Newark as we now see Cammie Anderson leaving. Was that an example where we didn't do a good enough job engaging the community, listening to concerns? But we're talking about, a state taking over failing schools, possibly chartering them out, teachers losing their jobs. I mean, is any amount of community engagement going to overcome the natural resistance that some people on the ground are going to have to these things? I mean, I guess what can you point to anywhere where this community engagement has worked and has made a difference, I guess?
So you can either do it and then engage people later, or you can talk them through the process, and you can invest the time in explaining why it is the case. Sometimes in some of these conversations that I have been in, people didn't even know the data of the school. The people in the community, parents, others, they knew that there were better schools, but they didn't know how long and how chronically underperforming the issues were at those schools. And so explaining it and taking the time and then engaging in a conversation about what it looks like I think it is extremely valuable. And the things that you will learn and the people that you will listen to will allow you to roll this out and implement it in a better way.
Excellent. Good. Chris, what about from you?
Lessons learned? Well, first, I think this is a really important conversation, because I think what we tend to do in education is chase like the next bright, shiny thing. And what I'm worried about is that this is going to become the next bright, shiny thing. And, the challenge with that is that, you think about charters, however many years ago, what we can't have is the situation where for every one of these, there's 5 bad ones, like there was in the early days of charters, because our N is 50, So if we're going to do this, every single one of these needs to be done well. So I'm glad we're getting a chance to have this conversation. I think a couple things. One, and these may be a little bit more technical, but when you're thinking about getting these things started, it has to be created and birthed, even if it's part of the Department of Ed, separate from the day-to-day, just bureaucratic culture and rules that exist in most state agencies. It's not by accident that a lot of innovation doesn't happen inside state departments of education. Okay? In fact, I would challenge folks in this room to tell me 3 and that have happened in the last 10 years, besides what we're talking about today. So it's got to be separate so that it can stand up, be its own thing, and then there may be a time and place where this gets folded back into the operations of the DOE, but it needs a certain period of time, at least 3 to 5 years where it stands up on its own. Otherwise, this thing's going to get strangled in the crib and it's never going to get off its feet. I think.
And Chris, by the way, but your organization, are you a nonprofit or are you a government agency?
We're a subunit of the Department of Education.
All right, so and that has been okay. I mean, you still have civil service rules and all the rest.
We created flexibilities in the law that gave us, LEA flexibility when it came to things like contracts, procurement, and HR. If we had to live within state rules around those things, this would have never worked.
Okay. But you don't have to be a nonprofit per se. You can do it. Okay, go ahead.
I think the second thing, because we're going to talk about sort of finances in more detail, I think, in a second, but I think that's an important one. I just think we have to recognize that there's a limited charter supply. I mean, I talked a minute ago about how our charters are really neighborhood charters. I mean, the bottom line is that there are not a lot of great charter operators to begin with, and there's even fewer that understand how to do turnaround. So if you've got 10 or 12 states all out trying to recruit the same 4 operators, or 10 if we're generous, it's going to create an issue. And I would strongly urge states not to try and direct run a bunch of schools themselves. So if we don't solve the charter supply problem, then we can have as many of these on the books as we want, but it's going to be very difficult for them to actually be executed and done well.
Okay, great. Nelson mentioned a little bit and goes into it in the report, this idea of setting hard targets for what it means for a school to be turned around, so that then everybody knows that's what successful looks like, and then the school would supposedly go back to its home school district. And it sounds like it's only in Tennessee that has those hard and fast targets, although maybe the Michigan EAA is moving in that direction too. Tell us a little bit about that. How important is it to be very clear about that end game and be very clear about those targets? What's your take on that?
I think, Louisiana, we've had like 4 areas where I felt like we've been very strong that allowed us to get to the point where we're at. So number one, we have quality authorizing that we put in place. So in order to have the privilege to educate kids in Louisiana, you have to go through a rigorous charter authorizing process. Two, strong autonomy and accountability for schools. So you have the autonomy to be able to run your schools, manage your schools, but a very clear accountability system. And within that accountability system, we've set a bar in saying that when you take over one of these failing schools, you have about a 5-year window in order to transfer, to get it to go from an F to a D. And then if you made that, then we can renew you up to another 5 years or even more, depending on the progress you made. And for your second renewal, we raise the bar that you have to go and be at least at a C. And so I guess I would argue that our bar is set, and we have a hard and fast target that you have to hit, but you have windows in which to do that. And schools that have not met when they came up for their first renewal, if they didn't go from an F to a D, we turned them over. We either had the students go to just another school, higher performing school. We've had that recently happen. And also we have charters that just voluntarily turned in their charter and said we couldn't do it. And we admit we couldn't do it in the 5-year window. And what happened was we then have other charter operators that are poised to take over maybe a whole school because it may be too large to absorb in the rest of the system. And so I think that autonomy and accountability strengthens that. And the other two things is, thirdly, is the quality of teachers and leaders that we have. I can't stress that enough. That's what really makes everything go. Those closest to the children and having like very strong people in those leading roles has been very effective for us. And then the fourth thing is what I call like nimbleness in our policy making. And so for us to be able to change and make policy decisions in very short order, like in a matter of months, versus where traditional school districts, sometimes it takes years, maybe even longer, for them to make policy changes. And so I think those things undergirded our system, but clearly the defined targets through our charter contracts and making certain that if you don't go from an F to a D within a certain window and then to a C, that you won't have the privilege to educate kids anymore. So we set those targets very clearly.
Okay. And how does this work in Tennessee, Chris? What's your take on these hard targets that you have? Is this still, you think, the right approach?
I think it was really important for us to get this started. I mean, what you have to remember is when we started this in 2011, there was, nothing existed. I walked into an office with a sheet of paper on some legislation, and the charge was go start a school district. And so what you have to understand is when you're trying to get something off the ground, you have to generate momentum and energy around that effort. And I think, setting an ambitious goal of bottom 5 to top 25, it was a data-driven goal that we set. We went back and we looked at the data that, our fastest improving schools and districts in the state had achieved over the last several years. But I think it created a momentum and an urgency that we needed to create to be able to get this off the ground. It's allowed us to recruit, partners. It's allowed us to recruit teachers, leaders. Because if you don't set that goal, it would have been way too easy for us to just say, you know what, we're going to get schools off the list. We could have set that as the goal. We're going to get schools off the priority list. That would have been a bottom 6% school. And nobody in this room would feel comfortable if you're a parent sending your kid to a school that's in the bottom 6%. So for us, we just didn't feel like, saying that's our goal and saying we're going to declare victory there. We said, look, we want to create schools that every single one of us in this room would be proud to send our kids to. And we felt like, setting a top quartile goal, allowed us to do that. And if you look at the collective momentum and urgency from policymakers, funders, the local district, our charters, talent partners, what's happened over the last 2 years, we've got priority school students growing 4 times faster than the rest of the state in Tennessee. And if you look in Memphis alone, which is where most of the schools are, there's 4,500 fewer kids going to priority school today than there was just 2 years ago. So I would say, in 5 years, time will tell whether every school is able to meet that goal. But it's created a game worth playing for people, and I think it's allowed us to recruit the type of people we need to this effort that's going to help us win. And so,
but let's be clear about this, Chris. The goal, then, you're taking schools that are in the bottom 5% based on proficiency rates, and you want to get them to the top 25% of the entire state.
Sure. And in Tennessee, that's about 65% of the kids being proficient.
Right. On a new, very challenging
Next year
standard.
will be in a new assessment.
Okay.
Yep.
That's a tough goal.
It's a tough goal. And can I just say one thing? We're going to get incredibly scrutinized about this. And you know what? I think that's great. What I would say is every superintendent in the country should be under the same scrutiny we're under to get the kind of results we're being expected to get. And that's the game. We all need to be held accountable. We all need to be under intense scrutiny for all the reasons that Patrick mentioned earlier. These are high stakes, and we're talking about kids' lives. So we welcome that scrutiny. I would say, just apply that same scrutiny to every other superintendent in the country is being applied to us over this goal. I think that's fair.
Veronica, is it true that Michigan's changing its approach on this one?
Yeah, so originally there was no specific goal. Michigan does not have a letter grading system. It is something that is being contemplated in the state of Michigan, but it has not been enacted yet. So my goal, especially in the charter RFP that we just did to try to attract more charters into the EAA to take over schools that we either receive or that we have currently, is to motivate people to come in and do this very hard work. So we set a 50% goal. We said within 3 years of your contract, of your charter contract, you have to be above 50% performance.
50%, so what, at the state average
Yes,
for proficiency?
that's right.
Regardless of demographics,
That's
et cetera,
right.
which again would be a remarkable accomplishment.
Can I just also pay a compliment to Veronica too, because in the early days of the EAA, she is the second leader of the EAA, and under the prior regime, when they got criticized for not moving the schools on achievement, the response was, well, we have internal tests that show growth. And you were just very candid when you took over and said, sorry, this is not acceptable. The rate we're going is not fast enough.
That's right. And growth is great, and we measure growth, and we have tools that measure growth, but it's growth to proficiency. Like we need kids to be reading and doing math and writing proficiently in order to succeed.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second part of this question is about the end game. All right, you heard a couple of us already use these health analogies, right, about what's the disease, what's the symptom. Nelson talked about how you should think about this as long-term rehab, not an emergency room. But does it make sense at some point to hand these rehabilitated schools back to their home districts? What if those districts are still as dysfunctional for a variety of reasons, maybe no fault of their own, but just as dysfunctional as before? Is that really what's best for kids? How do you think about this problem? And but also knowing, as other people raise, that we have issues here, of course, about local democratic control, that local citizens, parents, taxpayers, they want control over these schools again. So how do you think about this, Patrick?
Well, people in New Orleans, that's been a big question because we're coming up on the 10-year remembrance of the Katrina catastrophe. And as we embark on that coming up in a couple of months, the question has been, well, since we've had so many schools that are now eligible to return, when will they return to local control? And right now we have a law that's in place that says that if a school has met the standard for 2 consecutive years, it's up to the school, that board, that charter board, to make that decision. And to date, only 2 schools have elected to return, and one of them actualized upon it thus far. And that's been over the last few years, where there have been almost over 60 schools, I believe, cumulative over the last couple of years that's been eligible. And so we think that those who have earned the privilege to continue to educate kids should make that determination when the time is right for them to go back. And I think in New Orleans, what we're doing with the Orleans Parish School Board is we're working on what we consider, what I'm calling the equity floor. So there are policies that the RSD has in place that the OPSB doesn't. And those schools want to know that if they're going to serve the most challenged kids, that they should not be disadvantaged by going back to the local governing entity. And so as we're building this great movement of what's allowing educators to be able to serve our most difficult and challenged students, they just want to be certain that whatever the governing entity that's in place, they will carry over those policies that are affording us to see some success. And so, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about governance. I think the public, parents will determine that ultimately by how they communicate with their boards and when's the time to go back. But we're going to continue to work to build this equity floor so that we continue to have differentiated funding, meaning that for our most challenged youth, special needs youth, our English language learners, that instead of just getting, equal funding, that they're going to get equitable funding. You need more resources to serve the more challenged kids. That we're going to continue to have an open enrollment system for all students, and that we're going to make certain that our most challenged youth, whether or not they're truant or absent, or students that have emotional and extreme behavioral disorders, that there are policies that are in place from a governing perspective, that's going to ensure that schools will be supported in order to maintain them. And currently we do that in the RSD. And so that's going to determine more so for us what long-term governance looks like.
All right. So I mean, what I'm hearing you say is you're not comfortable turning these schools over until you're confident that the local board is ready to create the conditions for success.
The schools are not comfortable, so
And the
we
schools
don't
are
have a
not-
say-so.
Gotcha, okay.
RSD, we don't have a say-so. Those schools earn the privilege and the right to determine, and they will say when they are ready to go back.
Okay. Veronica, how do you think about this?
Yeah, that hasn't been laid out for the EAA since its inception. That's one of the things that came up in the legislative process. How long would it take to do this work? And generally, people have some consensus around 4 to 6 years is the time that it would be within the state structure and support and governance. But I think to Patrick's point, this is, we should be thinking about ways of empowering that school community to make that determination. And if that's some sort of a parent trigger option, or if that's some sort of a vote by the team that's there with parents to figure out what's the next best step for the school, is the direction that we should be moving in.
Great. And of course, governance in general is a big question mark in Detroit right now.
Right. Right.
I'm going to get to spend some time there tomorrow. Looking forward to it. Okay, Chris, what about from your perspective?
Well, first, I love listening. The reason I came is because I wanted to learn from these guys. So just listening. So I wrote down equity floor. So I'm going to have to follow up with you on that one. It's funny. We were talking about this before we started the panel. So it was almost 4 years ago to this day that I was in New Orleans because I'd announced I was taking this job, and I was in the transition just to kind of learn what I could from the folks in the RSD before I started in the ASD. And one of the things I heard from everybody was there was no end game, no exit strategy. And so we tried to deal with that in the law in Tennessee pretty clearly and kind of up front. And it's clear. 10 years, the charters go back to local control. That's the renewal period. And when it's time for the charter to get renewed, it goes back to the local district. And they become the authorizer. And our belief is that at that point, it will have gone through 3 cycles of our own accountability framework, and it would be pretty difficult for the district to do anything different in those schools. It's also, this question is why, one of the reasons we felt so strongly about chartering most of our schools is because, as a separate nonprofit with a separate board, it had a much greater likelihood of going back to the district and being able to go back intact with the freedom to do the things that it was allowing it to do for those 10 years to be successful. And I guess the last point of this I think is important is, while it may sound counterintuitive to think of a state giving schools back to their community, that's exactly what we see our role in the ASD, is to take a school away from a local district, to have it be converted as a charter, and to have folks from that community sit on the board of that school, not 9 elected officials who are responsible for, in the case of Shelby County, 300 schools, but 5, 6, however many folks are on that nonprofit board, who every decision they make is focused on what's happening in that school. And we see this as actually hyper-local control. And so, our approach is that we see our job as giving the schools back to the community. And when you first talk to folks in the neighborhood about that, and they see the state and they think top down, it's hard for them to wrap their head around this idea. And we hope that over time, as they see the kind of autonomy and freedom they have, not just at the school level, but in the governance structure, that more folks will come around to this idea. But if you think about it, we got 14 operators. If there's 5 to 10 people on every single one of those boards, that's 100 or so people who are now directly engaged in what happens in that school. That's to us a much better approach than 9 elected board members trying to make trade-off decisions every single day on how resources get allocated at a district level.
Now, that's a really interesting point, especially as you say, we're talking about, in your case, a huge district. How many kids do you know does Shelby County serve?
Over 100,000.
Over 100,000. So this local school board, these are elected officials, serving vast numbers of constituents versus a hyper-local school boards over each of the charter schools. And yet, let's push on this a little bit. You are facing some real challenges, my understanding, just from reading the press accounts, Nelson's report, from the community in Memphis. And some of these local communities, they feel disenfranchised. What's your take on that? Is that authentic? Is that something that can be addressed? Is that just the union stirring up trouble? What is that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really complicated question. It's tough to answer in like a 2-minute soundbite. But I would say that this is disruptive work, and we've tried to, from day one, authentically make decisions and work with community. I think the difference is community engagement and community empowerment. I think we've done a decent job of community engagement. I think where the real solution lies in all this is community empowerment. And I don't think we've done a great job of that. And I think that some of that's lays at our feet, and we're the blame for that. Some of that's our partners. Some of that's just the speed with which we've had to move at this. I think in the next chapter of the work, we all, and I would say us. I mean, I think we talked about this before we got up here, so I don't want to speak for these two guys, but I think we all agree that there has to be more parent demand for what we're trying to do. And that's for just reform, period. And until we have more parents demanding great schools, until we have more parents not saying, save our school when their school's on the bottom 5% with a 2% of their kids being able to read proficiently, then this is going to be a challenge. And that's on us to be able to try and work at that. But I also think the last thing I'd say in this is that we've got to be clear about when you see pushback in a place like Memphis and it's a community meeting, 95% of the people in that room are teachers. And it's not that we shouldn't respect teacher voice, and we absolutely respect teacher voice. And it's not that, we don't understand why teachers may push back on this, but teacher voice and community voice are not the same thing. And less than 10% of the folks in our community meetings were actually parents in the school. And so that's on us to make sure that we're doing a much better job of hearing from everybody. The teacher voice is an important voice. It shouldn't be the voice. It should be a voice. And I think we haven't done a good enough job making it a voice and not the voice. And that's the work that we need to do as we move forward in this.
Okay, very well said, Chris. By the way, you are so damn tweetable. You are speaking in 140 character sentences. This is perfect. There's a great conversation going on Twitter right now.
Hopefully I won't pay the price for that when I get back to Memphis.
But yeah, exactly. You handled that very well. And your equity floor, man, it's popular out there. People love it. All right, let's pivot a little bit. Money. This stuff isn't cheap, right? And in some states, we have Republicans getting excited about this idea, but Republicans, I can say I'm one of them, don't like to spend money. Right? And so people say, what does it take to run these things well, both in terms of what happens in the turnaround district, as well as the actual work at the school level? Do you have the resources? Nelson mentioned earlier, the original efforts in Louisiana, a lot of money that came in after Katrina. Then you've got Race to the Top that spurred efforts in Tennessee, tons of philanthropy, Eli Broad and others. In Detroit, places that don't have that kind of cash lying around, what do they do? How much money do they need to be looking at to do this right?
That's a tough question to answer. I think I was introduced to some work by Dr. Marguerite Rosa, where she talked a lot about return on investment in education. So ROI, and I realized that we're probably the only industry that really never worked towards having like a strong ROI. Like we just pump money, seems like, and to your point, Mike, people just get tired of saying we're spending all this money without any great results for it. But I think what we found is that if you have an intentionality around how to use your dollars. So initially we used SIG dollars to use that through the State Department as seed money, or we use the charter startup funds to really get strong school and school leaders going. Our schools absolutely run just on the average funding that all public schools in New Orleans and throughout the state run on. And so I think the difference is the intentionality of how you use those dollars and making certain that you're strategic in what you're applying it to. And so you have to, you could always use more, because it's particularly when you're serving with the most challenged kids. But when you know that you have limited resources, it's about how you go towards applying that and what you're going to apply it to. So whether it's through just more like teacher development, or if it's through how you're going to use your curriculum, or for wraparound services and looking to invest in that. I think schools have become very creative in using the state dollars and the federal dollars that they have, but being very intentional about it. That's not to say that there's always enough, But I think just really more smart intentionality and having to make more business-like decisions that we're going to put money towards X and not have to do Y in order to get to certain results. I think that's just what's different in how we go about looking at it.
Give us just a ballpark sense of if we walked in and wanted to go see your staff at the RSD. I mean, how many people are we talking about? How much money are we talking about just to run your operation?
Well, right now, our staff, we're very lean at the RSD. So we have less than 100 people now, and really we're going down to about 50, where we're just overseeing a very small, the majority of our staff is over enrollment.
I think you should note, by the way, not to interrupt, but when you went from direct run to all charter, what was the reduction in staff?
Oh, you had it in your report. I don't remember the
report.
exact number because about a couple of years ago, but we went from several, what was it?
It was about 500.
About 500 employees to less than 100 in 1 year. And so people knew we were phasing out. And so, we operate on a very extremely tight budget. With all of that, the majority of the money is from a very small charter admin fee that we assess the charters. And we basically give them back just the return for us in working on policy and that sort of development for them.
Okay. Veronica, this has been a big issue.
A big issue in
right?
Michigan. The first year of the existence of the EAA, the schools, lowest performing, highest poverty, one would say in the nation, did not receive Title I dollars. Big hit to the organization. Philanthropy stepped in and really supported the ongoing initiative in the schools to be able to come together and do the work. But it was, so things to think through is what is the state entity, whether it's your Department of Education or your whatever governance structures that issues the dollars, what are their rules? And how does that impact the launch of Opportunity School District or Achievement School District? Because it is critical to have those resources up front. We are now at a level that we do get our federal funds and we get the state funds and we're operating. And we have some philanthropic dollars for strategic initiatives, but they're not supplementing day-to-day operations.
Okay. And Chris, what about how does it work for your operation, not the schools, but your staff, your team?
Yeah, I think so. We think about funding a few ways. So there's the funding to get the ASD entity up and running. So we had, of the $500 million that Tennessee received and Race to the Top, $22 million was set aside to launch the ASD. So we thought of that as that was our startup capital to get the organization off the ground. That paid for all the infrastructure that we needed to create at the district level because I don't know what the situation in Michigan's like, but in Louisiana, the charters are their own LEA. We're the LEA for the charters. So that puts a level of oversight that we're required to do. So all the infrastructure to do that. And then we operate our 5 direct run schools as almost like an internal CMO. So there's almost 2 teams in the ASD. There's the LEA district office team that next year will provide oversight to all 30 schools. And then there's a team of folks who, from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed every day, they're worried about the 5 schools that we direct run. In our LEA office, we have about 30 people that do everything from all of our authorizing to accountability work to supporting our charters. That's kind of the work that happens there. And so that work is funded now that we're off Race to the Top on a 2.5% authorizer fee. That'll fund our district office budget is going to be roughly about $4.5 million a year. Everything else, 97.5% of every, state, local, federal dollars, because the dollars follow the kid, gets pushed out to our schools, and that's what they use. Plus SIG money. And we have a little I-3 money that we're able to disperse through a federal grant.
But it sounds what I'm hearing from all of you, though, is that it would be really hard to be able to afford to do direct run because there's not money for the administrative work for that, whereas charter authorizing tends to be less expensive and you can then use the charter authorizing fees to pay for it.
I think that's right. And then you have to think about the role of philanthropy. I think we think about philanthropy in 4 areas, right? So because we have a charter strategy, there's money for charter growth. There's money for all this sort of people partners, the TNTPs, the TFAs, the leading educators, the relays of the world, advocacy work, and then partnering with all the nonprofits that provide the social and emotional kind of supports that our kids and families need based on the neighborhoods that we're working in. And that's a whole different set of, pot of money that's being, handled through philanthropy. But I would argue that without that money there, it would be virtually impossible for us to implement the strategy that we implement in Memphis and in Nashville.
But I would say, aside from finances, the other thing is you don't want to recreate a school district. That's not what this is about. You want to foment change, you want aggressive growth, and you want to transform what's going on. And you don't do that by recreating a same school district that, on average, in many places is taking 40 to 50 cents on the dollar from schools. So.
Okay. We're going to get the audience in here in just a moment, so start thinking about your questions. Remember, you can still follow along. A lot of great tweeting happening at hashtag RSD Lessons. Okay. Let me ask you a question. Have you seen, New Orleans might be tricky because you're so dominant in New Orleans, and I know Detroit is kind of early, but have we started to see any evidence that the local school districts are responding in positive ways to either competition or the threat of having their schools taken over? Are we seeing some good things happening, maybe some ripple effects where you're at?
No doubt.
Absolutely. So people mistakenly think that RSD is just New Orleans, but we're statewide. So in the northern part of the state in Shreveport, where right now over half the kids in the district are in DRF schools. 2 years ago, they were under the threat for us to take over schools there, and we worked out an agreement with their local school board that they're now created their own turnaround district, where their goal is to eliminate all F schools in Shreveport within the next few years. And it's because of the threat of basically they don't want to be under state control. And so we were able to work with them and say, okay, well, what's your plan to turn around these schools? And of those 10, I believe about 5 have actually improved dramatically. They expect a few more in the next few weeks when we get our results to get out, and maybe the 2 high schools will be remaining. There was another instance, too, in a totally opposite, a very small rural area in Opelousas, Louisiana, St. Landry Parish, where you had a failing school that was ready for come under recovery school district. And literally 2 blocks away, there was a higher performing school that was a B on the letter grade scale. And because of local politics, they never considered merging the 2 schools together. We forced them by just the threat of RSD to do that. And that school was a B school. It took on about 240 kids from a chronically underperforming school. The very next year, the school remained a B. One of the teachers that came over got like teacher of the year for the parish. And I met a young girl in a reading lab from the failing school that following year. And I asked her, I said, well, you were in the failing school. How does it feel to be in this school now? She looked me in the eye and said one word: perfect. And I'll never forget it because the child's name was Precious. Yeah. And had it not been because of the threat of RSD, Precious would now still be sitting in that chronically underperforming school 2 or 3 grade levels behind. When the day when I saw her, she was in a reading lab that they had special pull-out time to get her on grade level. So those are some of the examples of how the indirect pressure of RSD has allowed our neighbors to really move and do the right thing for young people.
Very powerful. Chris, do you want to talk about the I-Zone?
Sure. I mean, we absolutely have seen, especially in Memphis, the districts step up and do a much better job. And I think if you talk to, the superintendent, board members, folks in the district, they would say that this is, really helped them create the sense of urgency they need to be able to do that work. The I-Zone is basically the district's turnaround model. And they've done a great job of incentivizing their highest performing teachers and leaders to go to the highest priority schools in the district, which wasn't the case. In fact, most great teachers, as soon as they could find a job in an quote unquote easier school, they would. They've been able to attract talent to these schools. And they're getting great results, both in growth and in proficiency. And so I think it's just a great example of, we get so hung up on the word chartering, and really what this is about is autonomy. And if you look at what the I-Zone's done is they found great teachers and leaders, and then they've given those great teachers and leaders the autonomy to make decisions around staffing and curriculum and budget and length of day, year, and week. And that's, any district can do that. You don't have to be a charter school. And I would argue that, there was nothing stopping Shelby County from doing that, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But the fact that, the ASD exists, the fact that we are actually bringing schools into the ASD, And the fact that they've responded the way they have, because not every I-zone in the state has gotten the same results that Shelby County has, I think speaks to just the way, if you do this right and get the carrots and sticks around this thing the right way, that it can work. The last thing I'd say on this is that, in 2012, when the priority list was originally run in Tennessee, the bottom 5% makes up 85 schools. 68 of those schools were in Memphis. So 68 of the 85 schools in the bottom 5% were in Memphis. And when we start the school year next year, there will be 19 unaddressed schools that are either not in the ASD, not in the I-zone, and some of those schools are making progress all on their own. And what I would argue is that we would never have had the capacity to create that many meaningful interventions in that many schools in that short period of a time. And I would argue the district couldn't either. But by us, working together, and it's not perfect all the time, we've been able to be really, I think, thoughtful about our resources and get more meaningful interventions in more schools in a much shorter period of time. And, like I said earlier, 4,500 fewer kids are attending priority schools than they were just 2 years ago. And we think if we can keep that going, we're going to see life-changing, progress for thousands of kids in Memphis.
Okay. Let's go to questions. As we always say, we want a question, not a speech, even from leaders of important national associations, Nina. But tell us who you are, ask a question, and we will give it a shot at answering it. Let's start with Nina back here. If you're following online, please tweet your questions to #RSD Lessons, because we'd love to get them.
I'm Nina Reese with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, and my question is about the federal role in encouraging RSD-like systems. And so you touched on funding a little bit, Veronica, but aside from funding, what else can the federal government do to support these activities, given that ESA is going to be on the Senate floor hopefully next week?
Okay. Anybody want the feds involved?
Well, I'll tell you this. Federal money was basically our sole source, race to the top. And if I had to do this over again, I would not have that be our sole funding source. I mean, the rules and challenges around that have been difficult. So I think there needs to be a diverse set of funding sources. But I think, incentivizing turnaround charter operators. Is there a way to do a carve out where the Green Dots and others who, the Aspire, some of the more national and even some of the local CMOs, is there a way we can incentivize more charters to want to do turnaround work? Because having done this in kind of the typical open enrollment, prep way versus what's happening now, this is way harder. It's just way harder. And so, we're not going to get the after school TV special stories that we get where the line does this every year. That's not turnaround work. And so, we have to have other funding sources because philanthropy wants to see this so they can put it in their annual report and talk about how great all their investments were. And if we're going to get, folks that are willing to be a little bit riskier in investing in this, especially right now when it's still very early on, I think that there's certainly a role for federal dollars as long as it doesn't tie your hands and the timing works. I mean, the SIG cycles and how this money gets dispersed, it never lines up with actual planning time to launch a school. You're expected to get the money and then launch your school. If you get the grant in March, you're supposed to open the school in the beginning of the school year. That's not a successful launch. So I think it's got to be money that's enough for folks to want to get in the game, but also be thoughtful about planning time and year zeros and things like that federal money right now doesn't necessarily allow you to do.
So let's play with that a little bit. So it sounds like one thing that the administration could do immediately is to try to tweak the SIG rules so that you didn't have these timing problems. You could also imagine some kind of carve out, maybe the administration, let's face it, they'll do whatever they want. So they don't worry about Congress that much these days. So they'll just carve it out if they want to. I mean, what about carving out a competition out of the SIG dollars that could have a competition for the turnaround operators to scale up? That seems like something, again, take it out of the SIG money rather than out of the public charter schools program. Right, Nina? Right, okay, good. All right.
Yeah. I think just two things that I think of. Just one, just whatever, changes that we could get through ESA, flexibility is important. So a lot of the restraints that are on traditional school districts, they weren't considered, I think, when they originally did ESEA for like a decentralized system such as in New Orleans. So we want to have accountability, but also within that we need flexibility. So sometimes you have, our schools are their own education agencies, and so to be able to give them that flexibility is extremely important. I had my second point. You come back to me, but I just feel like having that flexibility is extremely important now.
Yeah, just to echo, we're not a school district, and we're not set up that way. We don't have a director of title programs, et cetera, to write tons and tons of reports. The type of compliance and reports that are necessary for the federal funding is very, very extreme, and some review of that and consolidation of that would be critical.
Yeah, I remember now. And also, second thing is teacher training, so our teacher pipeline. And so I think like if through the federal government there could be incentives, particularly for students at historically black colleges, because oftentimes the students that we're serving are often minority students. And colleges of education, traditional colleges of education, really need to be, I think, incentivized to become more relay-like and leading educators-like, so we can get to scale much faster. Like those are great organizations, TFA, Relay, and others. But at the same time, in order to get to the mass that we have to get to, I think if there was some type of federal incentives to really get universities, and particularly our universities and colleges of ed, to think differently in how we train teachers and move from what it was when I was in the College of Ed over 25 years ago, to what I see now as being a lot more progressive, and some schools are implementing that. I think that will ultimately help us move forward faster. And so I think those are some things that hopefully that they can look at in reauthorization.
I just add one word to that. We haven't talked a whole lot about the talent pipeline, if you will. And I think Chris mentioned that there's a whole variety of organizations that all of you have been working with. And there are other states, though, where it's not just one big city where all the low-performing schools are located, where they're more disseminated around the state. I'm really looking at Georgia and how that rolls out next year, because how do you incentivize bringing a lot of talented young people and young teachers to some of these remote rural towns where they've got one or two really low-performing schools that could be part of that opportunity school district? So I think whether it's the feds or others, somebody needs to do some really clear thinking about the incentives, not just for getting teachers into the pipeline and getting new ways of training, but also to get them to those areas of need that are not so highly concentrated.
And to pile on about the talent thing, there are also challenges around diversity, right? I mean, that you've seen some debates play out in some of these cities where there is this sense that you are getting rid of union teachers and the district teachers who are often African-American teachers and replacing them with these white Teach for America recruits who come in here. I mean, is that something that you have faced in, say, New Orleans or in Memphis? And how do you deal with that racial component? That seems like a very challenging one.
Yeah, we've dealt with that, and today in New Orleans, over half of our teachers, about 60% are African American. Over half of our charter leaders are African American, and half of our charter boards. So I think we're actually more diverse and getting closer to like reflective of the diversity of New Orleans itself. But I think it was something that was very real that we engaged in and just in a very authentic way. I mean, we did have a large influx of young Teach for America teachers who on average, above average, actually did an excellent job. And so race does matter though. And so I would never sit here and say that, we're colorblind or it's just not, we don't see it. Yes, we see it, we live it. But I think these organizations have done a great job of recognizing that. Again, I mentioned TFA, which was one of our largest recruiters in New Orleans. A year ago and even this year, they've had their largest minority cohorts just continuing to go into it. While at the same time, it is just really a misnomer. We have a large percentage of African-American teachers, veteran teachers, that are leading the reforms and the changes that we're doing. I think the thing is that we still have to be very conscious about it. We have to get more Latino teachers in the system and have bilingual instructors. We have to be very intentional about it, but that's where, when we think about this work, so you have the everyday, just like with Chris, he's got to manage schools directly, and he's managing a portfolio district. I'm managing just totally a portfolio district. But then there are opportunities for others to then help to develop that robust, diverse pipeline. And so you can't do all things at one time. And that's why when the Pennsylvania question, it's like they have to figure out like what are some of the key areas that they want to focus on. And if you look at like a large city like Philadelphia or whatever parts of Pennsylvania they're in, they may have already some built-in entities that can be empowered to just spend all their time thinking about teacher diversity, teacher training, and how we're going to continue to build a pipeline for our schools. And then the school leaders and the government leaders in other realms can focus on just different aspects of the job. And that's one of the things we're learning. So we do admit that a lot of what we did was to the community going in, but now we're doing a lot of it with the community. And for me, it's using Chris's word, I love it. It's about empowering, but also I would add to that, empowering without abdicating our responsibility. Because as soon as we start behaving like the status quo was before, just to kind of be normal and fit in, then we're going to lose the momentum. And what I feel like that moral high ground to say, no, these children deserve better, they deserve better faster, and we have to be thoughtful about how we're going to make these changes.
Okay, good. Got a question over here? Is there, let's see, somebody up.
Hey, I'm Shivesh. I teach at KIPP Leadership Academy in New Orleans. So, Patrick, thank you for my job, essentially.
So coming to DC to meet you, good.
Yeah. So what I've seen in my work is that the environment that teachers and leaders work in can produce amazing results in a short amount of time. And they're doing things with kids that people maybe 10 or 15 years ago would say weren't possible, right? And are defying poverty. So this relates to the earlier question. I also, through my experiences and conversations with colleagues, think that we may come up against a limit, like poverty might be a limit eventually. So my question is, in your sort of roles as policymakers and the autonomy and flexibility you have, what opportunities do you see around poverty reduction, or opportunities you see to incentivize school leaders or school models that innovate around poverty reduction?
Great question.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, we have to diversify our delivery model in schools. So we can't just be no excuses schools. And yes, definitely want all kids to be college ready, but we also have to tie that into the workforce. And so what we've done in New Orleans, we've created a program called Jumpstart in Louisiana, where we're tying kids into high wage, high growth industries. And so by the time they finish their freshman year in high school, they're able to pick a path of which they're going to seek either credentials and certifications in high-wage, high-growth industries, often getting them into 2-year universities is the goal, or 4-year, and then going into livable wage-earning careers versus just, we get a lot of opportunity youth who finish high school, but then they ultimately, they don't maybe do a semester of college or a year in college and don't move forward. So I think that's one thing that we have to do. The other thing for poverty is that we have to keep in mind that the schools and the students that we're touching, it's been generational poverty. And so typically our students, the mom was in the failed school, the grandmom was in the failed school, the great-grandmama was in the failed school, and in some instances the great-great-grandmother was in the failed school. And so they've been living in decades of poverty. We have to continue to work on those areas that will give better services to families. So schools now, we're being placed into the role of what other government agencies, social work, the healthcare industry have been traditionally doing, and we're just kind of taking that on to better align what we call those wraparound services. So I think that's going to help lift out of the muck of poverty, while at the same time being very, again, intentional about what's our return on investment when we say a kid is doing an after-school program. What's our return on investment when we open up, like we're doing in New Orleans, a therapeutic day school in August for our students who have significant severe emotional disabilities, to where they can just be in a setting, try to get them reacclimated to a more traditional setting and move them right back into a regular classroom, which was something that came out of conversations with both parents and families. So I think those things will help lift up out of poverty, but we won't be the sole conduit. I mean, then it's going to take other government entities to play their part, but at least that's how we're looking at it and how we feel like we can make a good move to getting more people to a better place.
Let me just say, Patrick, I'm so happy to hear you talk about career and technical education, something we give so little attention to in this town, and yet has so much promise for a lot of young people. Anybody else want to weigh in on the poverty question?
Yeah.
Good one.
So a couple of other things that we've thought about in Michigan is, one, our schools are year-round. It's a requirement for our charters to be year-round, et cetera. We provide 3 meals a day. So that is critical to the population we serve, but also building partnerships. And I talked about engagement of the community. A lot of the engagement has led to successful partnerships. So we have in Detroit highly underutilized space in buildings. There's tons and tons of space. I always joke when I'm recruiting teachers that for a first-year teacher salary, you can own your own home in Detroit. And so because we have so much space, being able to leverage those partnerships. So bringing in a health clinic inside the school, bringing in psychological and counseling services, because these entities have to function and have to have a space. And why not go ahead and marry those two things? Now, let's not lose the focus. The focus is the focus, which is achievement for students. But how do you leverage and bring in more partners?
The only thing I would add is, I think this is the piece that you're bringing up is really what's pushing, when I talked earlier about charters who are used to just opening up their school and letting families pick them versus I'm now converting the neighborhood school. I think what we're seeing is this is really what's stretching them on how do I adapt and adjust my model to fit this new context. And I think what we're seeing is those that have really reached out and tried to figure out, the partnerships that Patrick and Veronica have brought up are the ones that are succeeding. I think the challenge is that there's a lot of nonprofits out there who are doing this stuff, but it takes a lot of time to figure out, well, who's doing it well and who's not. And luckily what's been created in Memphis in the last couple of years is an organization that really kind of vets all these different, social and emotional support nonprofits, kind of puts their good housekeeping seal of approval, puts them in a database that our schools know when they go here, this is someone that's been vetted, and you're not spending all your time figuring out, well, are these guys good or aren't they good? Because I think that's where a lot of times we get bogged down as educators. You want to be that connection point between kid and family to service, but you also want to have some confidence that when you connect the kid and family to whoever it is you're connecting them to, that something's actually going to happen. And that's not always the case. And so we're hoping that through this sort of third-party group that helps us kind of put that good housekeeping seal of approval on these guys, that we're going to do a better job of connecting our families and our kids to those resources, because they exist, and that should be our role. And we just need to make sure we're doing it as effectively as we can.
All right, there's a great question on Twitter, and I'll let you each have your last word on this one. It's about programmatic evaluation. How do you know whether your own efforts are successful? So let's say 5 years from now, how are you going to know that you in your respective turnaround districts succeeded? Patrick, how do you measure that?
I think we'll know that we're successful if we're moving the number of schools that we've moved from F to D schools, if we could significantly get them from D to C and really C to B. So I think just the overall continuation of improvement, of school improvement, to where we don't have any F schools in New Orleans. We have little to no, hopefully no D schools, and then really C moving up from C to A. I think that's going to be our biggest quantifier.
And by the way, those grades are all based on test scores.
Those grades are based, well, not all on test scores. So some of it's a combination, if depending on high school, on ACT scores, as well as student graduation rates.
Veronica?
So for us is ensuring that our schools are performing at the 50% level or above, and knowing that we are growing students towards proficiency at high rates at every single one of the schools that we are either direct running or have chartered. I think it's also critically important to move this conversation as it being a confrontational conversation in the city of Detroit, and to really say we have a citywide perspective on what's going on, and we are part of the solution in a more cohesive and collaborative way.
Great. Chris?
I think for us, it's results. I mean, are more kids college ready? Are more kids going off to technical school? I think in the more intermediate term, it's if we move schools out of the bottom 5% and into the top quartile. And then I think on an annual basis, we've developed an academic performance framework that looks at things like growth, proficiency, other metrics that we look at to see if our schools are moving along the right track. And our goal, as an organization, is that 80% of our schools are meeting our academic performance framework goals. So we've tried to kind of look longer term and more intermediate term, but it's all based on results. And we've got researchers studying us from GW and Vanderbilt, and those things are important to make sure that we're learning and getting better and that we can contribute to the collective good. But at the end of the day, we get out of bed because we want kids getting a better education, and we base that on the results that they're getting in school every single day.
Excellent. Nelson, you get the last word.
I'm going to have two last words. One is leadership. We haven't talked much about that, but as you can see from this panel, it takes an extraordinary combination of vision and passion and sheer managerial skill to make these things work. And I think we have three superb examples of that sitting at these two tables. And I'm just very proud to be in their company. The second thing is, to go back to a word that Chris used earlier, this is a disruptive innovation, no question about that. And for me, the question comes down to, is the disruption worth it? And I think what you've heard from all three of these district leaders is that it comes down to what's best for kids. You know, would you leave your child sitting in a school that had been rated F, or it was in the bottom 5% for year after year after year? And the bottom line is, do these things give those kids a better chance at a strong future? And I think if the answer to that is yes, then the disruption is worth embarking on. And thanks, Mike and Fordham, for holding this today.
Please join us in thanking this great panel. What a fantastic event. Couple of advertisements. First of all, this video will be available on our website at excellence.net immediately, so please do tell your friends, families, colleague. I think this was a fantastic conversation and hope we get a lot of people to listen in and to watch this. A couple Fordham programming notes. Stay tuned for an important new study that's coming soon from Fordham and the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools on charter schools and pre-K. Whether these two promising reforms intersect. Well, we have a report on all of the states that have both charter school laws and pre-K programs and how well they intersect. And then finally, look out for an announcement about an event that we're going to be hosting with Ed Fuel on leadership, that ever important topic coming soon. So again, thank our panel. Enjoy our drinks. Thanks for coming. See you next time.